Week 11 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup and break down every single quarterback and tight end and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. And before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 11 NFL pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 11's action. On top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em to help you get a win right off the bat on Underdog in Week 11 and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, very quickly, we have 4 teams on bye week here in Week 11. Let's start with the Carolina Panthers. So, no Bryce Young, no Jatavion Sanders. Then the New York Giants also on bye week here in Week 11. No Daniel Jones or Theo Johnson. And then no Tampa Bay Buccaneers, no Baker Mayfield, no Cade Otton, maybe more important. And also no Arizona Cardinals this week, so no Kyler Murray or Trey McBride, also probably more important here. Nonetheless, make sure you guys are checking your rosters, checking your lineups, and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with a divisional matchup on Thursday Night Football between the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia Eagles. Let's start with the Commanders side of things, as Jaden Daniels coming off of a bad performance this past week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. 8.5 fantasy points, 17 of 34, 202 passing yards, and just 5 total rushing yards. That was his worst rushing mark thus far on the season. And overall, if we exclude Week 7 against the Panthers, where he got injured and had to exit the game, easily his worst fantasy mark on the season. But I'm not going to panic here. I think some people might look at this matchup and get a little bit worried, as the Philadelphia Eagles overall have drastically improved their defensive efforts, and they're giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to the running back position. But it's Jaden Daniels. It's a short week. I don't want to overthink this one. We could see some defense go out the window here, but regardless, this is still your QB6 so far on the season. Rushing upsides there. The passing attack still looked very good against Pittsburgh in Week 10. Terry McLaurin still had a great day. Austin Eckler ended up with 2 touchdowns, so that took away some potential, passing touchdown upside or rushing touchdown upside for Jaden Daniels. So I'm not going to overthink this one. You own Jaden Daniels. We are still starting him on a weekly basis. Zach Ertz still in the streaming category, going up against the Philadelphia Eagles this week, giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. Not a fantastic matchup, but Zach Ertz just kind of lives in that streaming category. The upside's not massive here, but there's always a pretty safe floor involved for the most part on the season. So he's our tight end 14 so far. On the season, 8 targets, 4 catches, 31 receiving yards, 7.1 fantasy points in Week 10. It depends on who you have. If you have to roll with Ertz, it's okay, but probably not my favorite option this week. On the other side here for the Eagles, continue to start Jalen Hurts on a weekly basis, no matter what. 30.6 fantasy points in Week 10. That was his second best fantasy day on the season. He's been fantastic since the Eagles have returned from bye week. 14 of 20 this past week, 202 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 1 interception, but who cares? 56 yards on the ground and 2 rushing touchdowns. He now has a rushing touchdown, or at least 1 rushing touchdown in every game since Week 7. 2 or more rushing touchdowns in every game but 1 since Week 7. There's no way that we're benching Jalen Hurts this week, or any week for that matter. Dallas Goedert, on the other hand, did not practice to start the week. He's been a little bit banged up, but he was able to play Week 10, had a good outing against the Cowboys, 10.5 fantasy points, just 3 targets, 2 catches, 25 receiving yards, but one of those, obviously a touchdown. The Commanders, not great against tight ends, giving up the 19th most fantasy points to the position, but still okay. Regardless, if Goddard is a go this week, I would definitely start Dallas Goedert, and he is rostered in 78% of leagues, but like I said in the waiver video, double check If Dallas Goedert got dropped in your league because he did miss a couple games and then kind of carried that questionable tag going into week 10, you might be surprised. He might be out there and floating. He's a strong start here in week 11 against the Commanders. Moving along to Sunday's action, let's start with the Raiders traveling to face the Dolphins. Gardner Minshew got to be a sit this week, as that Dolphins pass defense still one of the best in the league, giving up the second fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. Tough go for Gardner Minshew this week, and I don't know why you would be starting Gardner Minshew anyways. Brock Bowers, on the other hand, is a player that we still have to continue to roll with in fantasy football. He's your tight end 2 so far on the season. He's given you a single-digit performance just twice on the year. Last time we saw him in action in week 9 against the Bengals, 15.5 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 grabs, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Keep rolling with Brock Bowers regardless of matchup. He is one of the best in all of fantasy football at the tight end position. We cannot bench him. Now, on the other hand, Tua Tagovailoa, I'm just going to have as a sit. I thought there was some stream appeal this past week, and I mean, he's been fine, I guess, since he's returned from concussion protocol and everything, but not really great at all from a fantasy standpoint. He did have, carved out 17.5 fantasy points in week 9 against Buffalo. Looked good enough in his first game back against Arizona, but it's just not giving you a high enough ceiling from a fantasy perspective. And then obviously on Monday Night Football, 9.1 fantasy points, had a lost fumble, had an interception, to throw 1 touchdown to Tyreek Hill, 20 of 28, 207 passing yards. But I just don't want to do it. There's no upside here. And the Raiders, at one point in the season were okay against opposing quarterbacks, wide receivers from a fantasy standpoint, but they've fallen to giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, which is still a good matchup here. So you might look at this and think there's some stream appeal or whatever, but I'm just going to stay away here. I don't want to start Tua this week. Super flex, double quarterback, you're desperate. Sure, the matchup is there, but I just don't know if I see any real perceived upside with Tua going into week 11. We will find out. Johnny Smith, on the other hand, I'm fine with starting. I think or I guess I should say streaming. He's just kind of in that area where you need points. There's nothing out there. You could stream Johnny Smith. That's how I felt going into week 10. 7.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 catches, 45 receiving yards. We're certainly looking for much more than 7.5 fantasy points, but if you're absolutely desperate, I still think he's in the streaming area. He's a top 20 tight end so far on the season, but this is not a great matchup, as the Raiders have only allowed the fifth fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So, you have to be a little bit desperate here, but Johnny Smith just kind of lives in that, you're desperate for points, you can stream him. So, for the most part, don't really like this matchup overall. Brock Bowers really the only name that we're looking at as a strong start in this matchup here in week 11. Let's move along to the Browns traveling to face the Saints, and let's start with looking at my guy Jameis Winston. And I had Jameis Winston as a sit going into week 9. I know we saw some nice fireworks against the Baltimore Ravens in week 8, but that was the Ravens. They're giving up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season, and he got pretty lucky in that game. He should have probably thrown at least 2 interceptions. And then in week 9 against the Chargers, a much better defensive unit, 3 interceptions, 235 passing yards, and a passing touchdown, but just 13.1 fantasy points. So it's not a great matchup, as the Saints are giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I'm going to stay away from Jameis Winston still. You'd have to be really desperate in a double quarterback super flex format to even consider Winston this week. So I'm still staying away. I don't think he's a strong streaming option or anything like that. David Njoku, on the other hand, I will continue to start. I think he's perfectly fine here. The Saints giving up the 26 most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Njoku's been fine. The ceiling a little bit lower, of course, in week 9 when we last saw the Browns play. 7.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 29 receiving yards. But since week 6, he's had 7 or more targets in every game. Good matchup here. Top 20 tight end on the season. We know there's going to be some volatility, but David Njoku is definitely still a strong start here in week 11. Moving on along to whatever we got going here for the New Orleans Saints. So let's take a look at Derek Carr. I've got him as a sit. Was not that bad this past week against the Atlanta Falcons. 20.4 fantasy points, 269 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 17 yards on the ground, had a fumble. It was not a lost fumble. So don't get me wrong, maybe there's a scenario you could stream Derek Carr, but we haven't seen any real consistent ceiling for Carr on the season thus far. And the Browns, while they're not a great defense, they're only allowing the 15th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. So it's not really a great matchup here. I just don't see any real reason why you would need to stream or start Derek Carr here in week 11. So I've got him as a sit, and we'll just see what happens. Now, Taysom Hill, I still think, is in that streaming category at the tight end position. A little bit disappointing in Week 10 against the Atlanta Falcons, as he only had 7 fantasy points, and that's just kind of part of the Taysom Hill experience. The volatility is going to be there. We saw him score 16 fantasy points against the Carolina Panthers. Who knows what's going to happen? It's always a risky start, but the Browns have given up the 28th most fantasy points to the tight end position thus far on the season. It's a good matchup, but also we have to kind of consider the fact that it's hard to look at Taysom Hill as a pure tight end and kind of compare him in terms of rankings against tight ends, because he's getting snaps as quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, whatever, So I think Hill's fine to stream this week if you're desperate, but I would also be a little bit concerned in terms of what we're actually going to get if you start Taysom Hill this week. Jawan Johnson, 4.2 fantasy points in week 10, and then Foster Moreau, 0 fantasy points, 2 targets, 0 catches. So not considering either of those guys as starts as we head in to week 11. Oh, man. Okay, next up we have the Colts traveling to face the Jets. It's been a while, I feel like, since we've had a matchup that is all sits. And I got a matchup for you this week that is all sits. That's the Colts at the Jets. So Joe Flacco, 13.8 fantasy points in week 10, 4.06 in week 9. Yeah, this, potential streaming option we were going to have with Flacco at quarterback is long gone. The Jets allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. 26 of 35, 272 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. None of that bad in week 10 against Buffalo, but 3 interceptions and a lost fumble completely spoiled the day. There's no way that we can trust Joe Flacco. Even if the Jets defense is starting to tear off a little bit, like I said, they're still top 10 against the quarterback position. So no Joe Flacco for me this week, and no Colts tight ends. I'm not even going to break them down for you guys. There's nothing there from a fantasy standpoint when it comes to the Colts tight ends. Now, I thought that Aaron Rodgers had some streaming capability this past week, and I was definitely wrong about that. After he had 20 fantasy points in week 9 against a Houston Texans secondary that has struggled on the season, he had 4.04 points in week 10 against the Cardinals, was 22 of 35, 151 passing yards, no tutties, no interceptions, but a lost fumble in this game. So Rodgers gets the Colts. It's a good matchup this week. They're giving up the 26 most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season, but man, come on now. I'm just staying away from this situation. There's no real consistency here. We look back, dating back to week 6 for Aaron Rodgers, 17 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 7 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So outside of week 10. So there was some consistency there, but the 4-point fantasy mark, the way that the Jets offense looked this past week, I'm just staying far, far away. And I think most of you out there would agree. Now, you're desperate. You have to play 2 quarterbacks. You're in a super flex league. The matchup is there, but boy, I just want nothing to do with this Jets offense outside of Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson, maybe Devontae Adams right now. All right, Tyler Conklin, on the other hand, 1.8 fantasy points in week 10, 2 targets, 1 catch, 8 receiving yards. No consistency here as well. Just stay away from Tyler Conklin this week. He's not in the streaming category. He's not a player that I want to start. This matchup is a mess. I'm staying away from it here in week 11. Let's move along to the Vikings traveling to face the Titans. And we got to start by talking about Sam Darnold, who kind of went back and forth. Is Darnold a streaming option for me this week, or is he a sit? Not very pretty in a smash matchup this past week against the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 10. And I know I told a lot of people to start Sam Darnold this past week. Felt that this matchup was way too strong to ignore, basically for all of the Vikings offensive players. And what happened? I mean, just super disappointing this past week. Darnold, 24 of 38, 241 passing yards, 3 picks, 28 yards on the ground, just 9.4 fantasy points. We go back to week 7 after the week 6 bye week. We've got 17 or more fantasy points in every game for Darnold except this past week with a ceiling of 21 fantasy points. Difference in week 9 to week 10 was that he had 3 turnovers as well in week 9, a lost fumble and 2 picks, but he was able to throw for 3 touchdowns. So the 0 touchdowns this past week really hurt his fantasy stat line. I'm not ready to fully downgrade Darnold to a sit, but like I said, I was pretty close. It depends on who you have at the quarterback position, but I still think he's streamable. The Titans kind of right there in the middle, giving up the 17th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So it depends on who you have. I still think he's startable. I don't know if he's my favorite start here in week 11, but I hope that things get going again there. TJ Hawkinson, we talked about a lot going into week 10. Talked about him in Sunday morning's video as a must-start tight end. 15.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 8 catches, 72 receiving yards against the Jaguars. I mean, this was one player in terms of the Vikings offense that did show up due to matchup against the Jags. Definitely happy if you started him. Here in week 11, the Titans, a much stiffer matchup, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but I still think he's a good start this week. I know the matchup's not great, but the Titans, one of these teams, like they've been pretty stout in terms of fantasy points allowed against specific positions, but then when you go to start players against them, it doesn't really matter. They're a weird defense. So Hawkinson maybe should, due to matchup, be closer to a streaming option. But overall, I think if you want to roll with Hawkinson, he's a good start this week. On the other hand, when we look at the Tennessee Titans, sorry, I had Mason Rudolph's name up there in honor still, but he's not the starting quarterback anymore. Will Levis is the starting quarterback for the Tennessee Titans. So 19.1 fantasy points in week 10 for Levis against the Chargers defense. I will say I was impressed. I was surprised. And most importantly, this was Will Levis's first game without a turnover on the season, as well as his first game with no interception on the season. He did have a fumble, but it was not a lost fumble. 175 passing yards, 2 passing TDs, 18-23. This was the cleanest game for Levis so far on the season. He also added 41 rushing yards. So what do we do here? I mean, I'm not starting Will Levis against the Vikings defense, giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Don't feel good about this one, but it's a home game for the Titans, and you never know, but, even if things were close last week for the Vikings, Mac Jones still had an awful fantasy day. Let's see here, coming through with just 7.2 fantasy points, 2 picks, and a lost fumble. So I think Will Levis could definitely come back to earth this week, and I have no interest in starting him from a fantasy standpoint. For any reason, Mason Rudolph was back in the mix, which he's not going to be, doesn't look like. He would not be a start for me either. Chicken Conquo is a sit, 2.4 fantasy points this past week. Josh Weil, 1 target, 0 catches, 0 fantasy points. He's a sit for me as well. We'll see what happens in this matchup as we get into week 11. Next up, we will have the Green Bay Packers traveling to face the Chicago Bears in a divisional matchup. Jordan Love, in his last 2 starts, 11.9 or less fantasy points. That rain game against the Lions defense improving. The groin injury to Jordan Love. He really needed this bye week. Probably should not have played in week 9. Complete disappointment from a fantasy perspective in week 9. I think the week 10 bye week, very important for the Packers. Hopefully changes things up here. But, I'm still good with starting Jordan Love. But I will say, if you have other options, go with those other options. I was very close to actually putting Jordan Love as a sit this week, but I think with the bye week included here, the Packers can put together a game plan to kind of exploit the Chicago Bears, who just don't look very good right now. But with all of that said, the Bears have still allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks thus far on the season. So I'm a little wary of Jordan Love this week. Depends on who you got, but I want to believe that he can bounce back and give us a good floor here in week 11. We will find out. Double check who you have. I'm a little concerned about Jordan Love this week. We also just don't know how fully healthy is Jordan Love actually going to be. Tucker Kraft, on the other hand, I'm kind of in the same boat. 7.6 fantasy points in week 9, 6 targets, 4 grabs, 34 receiving yards. The Bears are allowing the second fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. So I'm also a little bit worried about Tucker Kraft this week, as he has not been necessarily consistent from a fantasy standpoint, and he's very touchdown dependent when we really break down the stats. He's had a touchdown in every game but 2 since week 4, and games where he has scored a touchdown, 12 or more fantasy points, and games where he has not scored a touchdown, 7.6 or less fantasy points. So I do worry about Tucker Kraft, and I've said that for the past couple weeks. Like, you take away the touchdowns, what are you really left with? And then here in week 11, we have a tough matchup. So just look at who you've got. I still think Kraft is startable. I still think Jordan Love is startable, but maybe tamper your expectations. I feel good about the Packers this week, but the matchup on paper is not so good. So this one's a little bit tough. Look at who you got and what your options are. Now, I don't feel so good about the Chicago Bears. Let's start with Caleb Williams, who has been a complete dumpster fire in the past couple weeks. And it's definitely at this point, I don't know if you even need to roster Caleb Williams. This upcoming stretch for the Bears is super tough. Super tough. Green Bay Packers this week, then the Vikings, then at the Lions, at the Niners, at the Vikings, the Lions at home. Then the Seattle Seahawks may be okay, but overall that stretch is just not good, especially with the way that this Bears offense has looked against the Commanders, the Cardinals, and the Patriots. Not to discredit any of those teams, but yeah, I just want to stay away from Caleb Williams. 9.9 or less fantasy points in 3 straight starts, 6.3 fantasy points in week 10, 16 of 30, 120 passing yards, 15 yards on the ground. The offense was just nowhere to be found against the Green Bay Packers. So I'm very concerned, against the New England Patriots this past week. So I'm very concerned about Caleb Williams going up against the Packers this week, allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points to the position so far on the season. And they're also allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So Cole Kmet, 3.3 fantasy points this past week, 4.4 or less in the last 3 weeks. Both of these guys are going to be sits for me this week. We really break it down. You know, there's a nice little stretch there between weeks 3 and week 6. Not really so much against the Rams defense in week 4, but every other game was solid enough or good for Cole Kmet or Caleb Williams. But they played the Colts, the Panthers, and the Jags in that stretch. Those were the teams that we saw positive fantasy outings for Caleb Williams and Cole Kmet against. Hasn't looked so good when we're not playing some of these bottom tier defenses. So Caleb Williams, Cole Kmet, I don't think they even really need to be rostered, in my opinion, as we go into week 11. Next up, we've got the Jaguars traveling to face the Lions. Okay. Mac Jones in week 10 against the Vikings was bad, as we discussed briefly earlier. 14 of 22, 111 passing yards, 2 tutties. 2 interceptions, not 2 touchdowns. I'm just going to leave that in. I'm not even going to fix it. 8 rushing yards. He did have a rushing touchdown. Did have a tutty on the ground. 1 fumble. Jeez, butchering the Mac Jones stats. It wasn't good. 7.2 fantasy points. Now, there are some rumors that we might get Trevor Lawrence this week. I would not start either of these quarterbacks. I would feel better about T-Law, but, he's got the shoulder injury. It's not in his throwing arm. He might have season-ending surgery. He might not. I just think it'd be kind of weird to push for Trevor Lawrence to play this week when the Jags have a bye week in week 12. I don't think it's going to be Trevor Lawrence, but there are at least rumors of Trevor Lawrence playing this week. I don't want to start either quarterback here. The Lions defense has looked much better, but they're still allowing just the 14th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, so it's not like a fantastic matchup, but it's certainly not a good matchup at the same time. So anyways, I don't know why I'm breaking this down so extensively. There's no reason to start Mac Jones or Trevor Lawrence this week. Evan Engram, on the other hand, well, he probably still has a good floor. He had 10 fantasy points in week 10 against the Vikings, 8 targets, 6 catches, 40 receiving yards. He is probably the only Jaguars offensive player that I'm looking to start at this given moment, and that includes Brian Thomas Jr. as well. So Engram, we'll get a check mark here. We'll keep rolling with them. The Lions have struggled mightily against the tight end position on the season, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the position. So Ingram, good start. Keep rolling with him. Jared Goff, 12.8 fantasy points in week 10. Five interceptions. 2 passing touchdowns, 240 passing yards, was 15 of 30. You could definitely argue this was his worst game of the season. But he's had some pretty bad games on the season. He's also had some pretty dang good games. So what do you get with Goff? It's hard to say, but I have him in the start category because the Jags are giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. This is a home game for the Lions. No reason to not start Goff here in week 11, unless you have better options, I suppose. We could also see a really big run game from the Lions this week. This could be a huge one-sided game, so I'll still say the matchup puts you in a position where you probably at least want to strongly consider starting Goff this week. Now, Sam Laporta is day-to-day as he is dealing with a shoulder injury. He had a good week in week 10, 15.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 grabs, 11 receiving yards, and he did score a touchdown. So really, for me, Laporta has kind of been in that area of you roll with the punches, you start him. I've encouraged you guys to not drop Sam Laporta after some panic early in the season, that you don't necessarily have to trade him away, especially at a low perceived value. And overall, if you've rolled with the punches, it's been annoying. But in the past, since week 6, he's had double digits in 3 out of those 5 games. So, at the tight end position, what more can we really ask for on the season? It's been a tough season. And once again, if Laporta plays this week, the Jags are awful against opposing tight ends, allowing the 27th most fantasy points to the position. So if he plays, if he's good to go, I would start him. If he does not play, let's keep a close eye on Brock Wright as a potential deep streaming option here in week 11. All right, let's move along to the Rams traveling to face the Patriots. Sam, boy, oh boy, what a gross overall matchup this one's going to be. I told you guys earlier, the Jets and Colts, I've only had so many matchups as of late where everyone's a sit, and I've got everyone as a sit in this one. But let's take a look here. Stafford, I'm just not going to do it. I know Miami's pass defense very good, but 32 of 46, 293 passing yards and a pick, 2 fumbles. Neither of them lost, but the 2 fumbles resulted in just 10.7 fantasy points after Monday Night Football, right? Listen, it wasn't that bad in terms of throwing the football. I mean, sure, he threw a pick, but he did throw the ball 46 times for 293 passing yards. Just no passing touchdowns. Regardless, I'm just not there. I was looking like Stafford could be a nice kind of streaming option, fill-in option, 18 or more fantasy points in both games in weeks 8 and 9. Sure, maybe it's there against the Patriots this week. They are allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, though. I just don't think you're really going to be in a position where you have to start him. It's not a good matchup. It's on the road here. It's still Stafford, so if you're in a desperation spot, okay, fine, but I just want to avoid him if possible. Colby Parkinson has had 0 targets in the past 2 weeks. I don't think he's really a thing anymore. Davis Allen has come in, had 3 targets in week 9, then 6 targets, 5 catches, 34 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points this past week. So maybe a name to keep an eye on, but I'm not going to start him anytime soon. Regardless, let's move along to the Patriots. Drake May has been a streaming option here and there at the quarterback position, but not nearly consistent enough for me in the past couple weeks. 12.7 fantasy points against the Chicago Bears, 15 of 25, 184 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, 24 yards on the ground. I just don't have any interest in starting Drake May this week. The Rams defense allowing the 19th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position, so it's not awful this week, but this Rams defense has looked much better in the past couple weeks. Just not a situation that I want to have any part of in fantasy football. But Hunter Henry, I've got him as a sit. I'm a little upset with this past week, which is maybe not fair because it was a bad matchup against the Chicago Bears. He walked away with just 2.4 fantasy points, 4 targets, 1 catch, 14 receiving yards. I'm sorry. I will say, if there's one player at the quarterback or tight end position in this matchup that I would start, it'd be Hunter Henry. I'm just like, do you need to start him? For the most part, with Drake May at quarterback, he's had double digits in every game, except week 8 against the Jets, which Drake May didn't play that full game, then this past week against the Bears. So he's a tight end 11 on the season, and the matchup here is not that bad, as we have seen the Rams give up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So he's probably streamable. I just don't like this matchup on paper going into the week, but if you have to start somebody in this matchup at one of these positions, it would be Hunter Henry here in week 11. All right, next up we have the Ravens traveling to face the Steelers. Should be one of the better overall matchups here in week 11. Let's take a look at the Ravens very quickly. Not a lot to dissect here. Lamar Jackson is a starter in fantasy every single week. No matter what, don't overthink it. You own Lamar, you start him. No discussion. 32.9 fantasy points in week 10, 25 of 33, 290 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, 33 yards on the ground. In the top of the MVP race right now. Start Lamar Jackson. Doesn't matter what the matchup is or who they're playing. Mark Andrews, on the other hand, also for me has been a start on a weekly basis since we've seen that consistent pattern emerge. 18.8 fantasy points this past week, his second best mark on the season. 7 targets, 6 grabs, 68 receiving yards, and a tutty. The Steelers allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Don't really care. I'm still starting Mark Andrews. Isaiah Likely did not play this past week. That week 1 performance against the Chiefs feels like it was decades ago. He's a sit, not considering him this week. Now, on the other hand, we've talked a lot about Russell Wilson over the past couple weeks. If you guys remember, dating back, going into week 7, I told you guys, pick up Russell Wilson. Stash him. Let's see what happens here. I don't think it's going to be as bad. I mean, it's been good, but you guys forget, when they made that change at quarterback, especially in the fantasy community, a lot of people are looking at Russell Wilson like, no thank you. Justin Fields, still that guy is the rushing upside, all that. And Russ has been very good, and he is a strong streaming option going up against the Baltimore Ravens this week, giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. We break it down for Russ. 19 fantasy points in week 10, 14 of 28, 195 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and a pick. Good. We go back to week 7, 24.8 fantasy points. We go back to week 8. It's not great, 13.8 fantasy points, but you have to remember, he threw 2 touchdowns in that game that got called back. He was still very good through the air, 20 of 28, 278 passing yards, and he did throw 1 passing touchdown. Just 2 turnovers in the past 3 weeks, 1 lost fumble in week 8, and then an interception this past week. Russ has been solid, but the most important thing here is the matchup. It's a home game for the Steelers. The Ravens secondary, complete Swiss cheese. Russell Wilson, probably my favorite streaming option this week, and I have encouraged you guys to go out and grab Russ for a few weeks now. He still sits at just 29% rostered. He's a top-tier streaming option this week, and he's got a very strong strength of schedule for almost the entirety of the season outside of week 15 against Philadelphia in week 17 at home against the Kansas City Chiefs, so he should be roster. And one line on Underdog that I love this week is Russell Wilson's total passing yards, sitting at 213.5 passing yards for the week. He has hit that in 2 of his 3 starts with the Steelers and was close to hitting it this past week, which was the only week he missed it. But I love this matchup for him against the Ravens. I'm anticipating a much better overall game script this week for Russell Wilson, so I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Wilson's total passing yards. Don't forget, new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code The Catch get that free NFL Pick Em for the week. Take your free Pick Em, take the over on passing yards for Russell Wilson. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up with promo code The Catch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Pat Freiermuth came through with 10.7 fantasy points this past week, 3 targets, 3 grabs, 17 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He's been very inconsistent, though, on the majority of the season. But Freiermuth gets the Ravens, who are giving up the 32nd most fantasy points to tight ends, which is the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So he's a good streaming option this week. He could certainly be a big part of the game plan. I would definitely consider him a strong streaming option. Darnell Washington, 3 targets, 1 catch this past week. He's seen a little bit of involvement, but nothing to spook us here. Freiermuth is the tight end to start on this team, and he has a great matchup against the Ravens here in Week 11. All right, next up we have the Seahawks, who will travel to face the San Francisco 49ers. I think this is going to be a little bit of a better game than some people are anticipating, but let's take a look at Geno Smith, who is your quarterback 10 on the season, coming fresh off of a bye week. So we go back to Week 4 of the season. He has 17 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2. It hasn't been pretty at times. I mean, he threw 3 picks in Week 9 the last time we saw the Seahawks play. He also threw for 363 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. He also had a fumble in that game. Wasn't a lost fumble, but still a fumble. Still had 25 fantasy points. So it's not a great matchup. The Niners are allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I still think Geno Smith is in that streaming area as we go into the week. Won't put him past that. But 17 fantasy points, 18, I think is very doable this week. Coming off the bye week, a little bit of rest, good game plan put together. It's doable this week, but I don't know if the ceiling is massively high. Noah Fant is actually expected to head to IR. Kind of forgot about that, not going to lie. So he's a sit. But A.J. Barner was actually the tight end that we saw get the most involvement in Week 9 against the Rams. So that's my mistake. 7 targets, 4 catches, 27 receiving yards, 6.7 fantasy points. Not enough for me to start a rookie tight end here in Week 11. Maybe keep an eye on him, but that would be the most I would be doing right now. On the other hand, the San Francisco 49ers, Brock Purdy, the QB8 so far on the season. He has been fantastic in the past couple weeks since Week 6, 20 or more fantasy points in every game. In Week 10 against a bad Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, 25 of 36, 353 passing yards, 2 tutties, and 17 yards on the ground. I think Purdy is a good start this week. The Seahawks right there in the middle, giving up the 18th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I'll still roll with Purdy if I own him. George Kittle's going into the week dealing with a hamstring issue because they are the 49 IRs. Everyone's hurt at some point. If once CMC's healthy, then Kittle's hurt. Once Jennings is back, Kittle's hurt. You know, I mean, come on. Anyways, Kittle, 14.7 fantasy points in Week 10. He's your tight end 1 on the season. He has double digits in every game he's played in this year except for Week 1. 4 targets, 3 catches, 57 receiving yards, and a tutty this past week. I'm rolling with Kittle no matter what. He is a must-start tight end. If he plays, you start him. End of story. We'll see how serious the hamstring issue is as we get into Week 11. Next up, we got the Falcons traveling to face the Denver Broncos. Kirk Chains. And I've told you guys week after week, if there's one quarterback that worries me in fantasy football on a weekly basis, it's Kirk Cousins. And I was very close to putting Kirko as a sit this week. It's just not a good matchup against the Broncos, giving up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. 11.2 fantasy points in Week 10, 23 of 38, 306 passing yards, no passing touchdowns, a pick. Just no real consistency here for Kirk Cousins. He's got the 2 big games against the Bucs. He's got a good game, 17.5 points in Week 2 against Philly, a good game against Dallas in Week 9 with 17.7 fantasy points. Outside of that, he's had 12.5 or less fantasy points in every game. He's a borderline desperation streaming option this week. And I would still kind of put him like in that range, like where Geno Smith is, where like 16, 17, 18 fantasy points is doable, but only if you're desperate. And I got to say, I don't think he's my favorite streaming option this week. Traveling to Denver, I just don't know if I can trust Kirk Cousins this week. Kyle Pitts, on the other hand, I do think is a strong start, but it is a tough matchup. Once again, the Broncos giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, but we look back since Week 5 for Kyle Pitts. He has 9.5 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for Week 9 against Dallas. So he's your tight end 6 on the season. I would keep rolling with Kyle Pitts. roll with the punches here. Depends on who else you have. Like I said, not a great matchup, but he's still, in my opinion, in that start category for sure. Bo Nix, your QB9 on the season, and we have been talking about Bo Nix for weeks here on the channel. Very clean game in week 10. 22 of 30, 215 passing yards, 2 touchdowns against the Kansas City Chiefs. No turnovers. Did have a fumble, but it was not a lost fumble. -5 rushing yards was not great to see because he does have rushing upside most weeks. But, yeah, I'll leave Bo Nix as a top 10 quarterback, QB9 right now in fantasy football as a start this week. This Falcons defense as a stream this week, has given up the 25th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So Bo Nix a solid stream this week. And, yeah, like I just said, I mean, he's pretty close to a start, but the ceiling hasn't been super massive in the past 2 weeks. No more than 18.7 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. You know, we saw a huge performance against the Carolina Panthers in week 8, 2 solid performances in weeks 5 and 6 against the Raiders and the Chargers. Not so great performance in week 7 against the Saints. Broncos ran the football a ton in that game. Overall, I like Bo Nix. I don't want to get too excited. I've gotten excited in recent weeks. Let's leave him as a solid streaming option with a good matchup this week. I would prefer to stream Bo Nix over Geno Smith, over Kirk Cousins. Atlanta Falcons, definitely a team that we want to exploit opposing quarterbacks against. Another line that I love on Underdog this week is going to be Bo Nix's total passing yards, sitting at 204.5 passing yards. He has hit that line 3 straight weeks, and he's hit that line every week since week 5, except for week 7 against the Saints. So I think this is a smash line against the Atlanta Falcons, who've struggled against opposing quarterbacks. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Nix's passing yards. And don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch get that free NFL Pick Em for the week. Take your free Pick Em. Take the over on Nix's passing yards. Once both lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Tight ends for the Broncos are just a no. Lucas Krull, Adam Trotman. Maybe there's somebody else. I'm not going to break down the stats here. There's nobody that you need to consider at the tight end position for the Broncos as we move into week 11. All right, next up, we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Bills. Should be one of the better matchups of the weekend. Let's start on the Kansas City Chiefs side of things. I've got Mahomes as a start. I've had him as a start for the past 3 weeks, and every week we've gotten very close to, like, he's in that maybe only if you're desperate area, or is he just a stream, or do we sit him? We were close to sitting him. It's not a good matchup this week. Let's see here. The Bills giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but 16 fantasy points against the Broncos, 266 passing yards, and a touchdown. You know, I mean, he's borderline sittable due to the matchup here, but he's still borderline very startable. It's been such a weird fantasy season for Mahomes, so depends on who you have here. But like I've said earlier in the week when we're looking at wide receivers, running backs, when it comes to this matchup this week, I'm expecting a good game script. I'm expecting these defenses to bend a little bit. So I will still start Mahomes, but temper your expectations. We could, of course, see a low ceiling like we saw last week, or we could see a little bit of a higher ceiling like we saw in week 9. Your guess is as good as mine. Travis Kelce, on the other hand, right back in that must-start category. We've been, talking good about Kelce for quite some time now, like dating back to weeks 3 and 4. So I would still start Kelce this week. There's no reason to bench him. Good game script here. He's had 20 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, 12 or more targets in 3 straight games, 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Kelce, very strong start this week. He's moved up to the tight end 8 on the season. Continue to roll with Kelce and ignore the noise. Noah Gray's just a sit for me going into the week. Josh Allen, tough matchup this week, but he's your QB5 on the season. 20 or more fantasy points in every game since week 6. I know we had a little bit of inconsistency to start the season, but my viewpoint on Josh Allen all season long is you start Josh Allen no matter what. Good game script here. Home game for the Bills. Start Josh Allen. Ignore any noise around the matchup. I think we're going to be just fine if we're a Josh Allen owner this week. Dalton Kincaid going into the week as questionable. Should have an asterisk next to his name. My fault there. His status is up in the air for the week. We know he departed last week early. Just 5 targets, 2 catches, 24 receiving yards. He was able to come back into the game. 4.4 fantasy points. If Dalton Kincaid plays this week, I think you can continue to roll with the punches here. The Chiefs have definitely moved up in terms of their overall ranking against tight ends, now giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to the position. They started the season much further back. So I think you could roll with the punches. A little bit discouraging what we saw this past week. If he doesn't play, obviously we're not going to start him. Really depends on who you've got. Once again, I like the game script here, but if he doesn't play this week, or if he does play, does the injury concern you? You don't want to start him. That's fine. He does have 7.2 or more fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 matchups, so there's somewhat of a floor here. I know some people are already ready to drop Dalton Kincaid. I get it. Maybe the injury pushes you over. He's got a bye week in week 12, but I still think due to the matchup, there's some upside, some hope for Dalton Kincaid in week 11. Moving along to Sunday Night Football, we have the Bengals traveling to face the Chargers. Joe Burrow has just been lights out his last 2 games with 30 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. He's your QB3 so far on the season. It's a bad matchup against the Chargers, don't get me wrong, at least a tough matchup. But yeah, you're starting Joe Burrow in a primetime game here in week 11, no questions asked. Just there's no way you can bench Joe Burrow. The ceiling is way too high. Mike Gesicki disappointed us this past week. 9 targets was nice, but 4 grabs, 30 receiving yards, just 7 fantasy points. Tanner Hudson, remember him? Well, he came in and vultured a touchdown this past week and actually ended up with 7 targets overall in a great matchup against the Ravens. So, yeah, tougher matchup this week. If T. Higgins plays, which he's still day-to-day, then that definitely impacts Mike Gesicki here. But I still think he's in that streaming category. It's not a great matchup. The Chargers are allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but he's streamable. But I will say if T. Higgins plays, my faith in Mike Gesicki goes drastically down. But if you need points, I'll probably get you some points if you're desperate here in week 11. Now, Justin Herbert has been bumped up to the start category. We had him as a start this past week as well. 19.7 fantasy points in week 10, 14 of 18, 164 passing yards, and a touchdown, but added some work on the ground, 32 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown as well. So this week he's going to go up against the Cincinnati Bengals, allowing the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Justin Herbert, a strong start, sitting at 54% rostered. I do think he should be rostered in more leagues as he has 2 solid matchups after week 11, getting the Baltimore Ravens and the Atlanta Falcons. Like Herbert this week, roll with him in a primetime game against the Bengals. Then we got my guy Will Dissly. He's kind of in that area of like a Mike Gesicki, Johnny Smith. Like, you're going to get some points. There's somewhat of a ceiling we've seen at some point in the season. But he's just a streaming option. 8 fantasy points in week 10, 6 targets, 5 catches, 30 receiving yards. Going to get some volume, going to get some catches. Probably won't score a touchdown, but at the end of the day, you can at least walk away with some fantasy points if you're absolutely desperate. But he is no more than a streaming option here in week 11. Next up, to finish the week, we have the Texans traveling to face the Cowboys, the Battle of Texas here. Let's start with C.J. Stroud, who last week I just said, do what you want. Your risk. Good matchup. Primetime game against the Lions. Should be there. It wasn't really there. 232 passing yards, a touchdown, 2 picks, a fumble that wasn't lost, 11.7 fantasy points. So I was pretty much ready to just call C.J. Stroud a flat-out sit this week. 12.4 or less fantasy points and 4 straight games. But now we get a primetime game against the Dallas Cowboys, whose season looks completely lost. They look like one of the worst teams, if not the worst team in the NFL, and they're giving up the 28th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So the matchup is here. We might get Nico Collins back this week. Joe Mixon's going to have a big game. Stroud is still startable this week, but once again, it's like if it doesn't happen this week, You might be moving on from CJ Stroud at this point in the season with a Week 14 bye week coming up and a not-so-great schedule outside of a Week 17 matchup in Week 17 for the fantasy playoffs. So Stroud, let's see what happens. It depends on who you have. If you got to roll with him, the matchup is there. But, yeah, it just hasn't been good the past month. Dalton Schultz had his best fantasy performance of the season in Week 10 against the Lions, a team that has struggled mightily against the tight end position. It's a not as good matchup this week because the Cowboys are allowing the 18th fewest points to the tight end position. They're right there in the middle. But I don't really care here. I just don't trust Dalton Schultz whatsoever. He has not hit double digits a single time on the season. Nico might be back this week. He sits at 60% roster. That kind of surprises me. If you own Dalton Schultz, you can probably just move on. And I'm not starting him in Week 11. I am also not starting a Cowboys quarterback, and unfortunately a Cowboys tight end. But Cooper Rush is set to remain the Cowboys starter, is the word that we've got. We will not see Trey Lance start this week, which is still probably a good thing. But Cooper Rush, I don't know if he's much better. -2 fantasy points in Week 10 against Philly. 45 passing yards, 2 rushing yards, 2 lost fumbles. He did not throw a pick, though. It's a good matchup on paper. The Texans are giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I'm not starting Cooper Rush, and neither are you, and we don't really need to discuss it. But in case you're wondering, the answer is no. Jake Ferguson, I want to like. It's a good enough matchup. The Texans giving up the 21st most fantasy points to tight ends, but I'm not doing it. I'm just not. Maybe there's a floor here. I don't want to find out. You don't have to drop him quite yet, but I'm not starting Jake Ferguson in Week 11. So this matchup on Monday Night Football, not looking very promising to me for quarterbacks and tight ends here in Week 11. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, and who you should be starting or sitting as we move into Week 11 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 11, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll answer every comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. But most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything you could possibly need to help you dominate Week 11 of 2024 fantasy football here on the channel. So make sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.